welcome to Varmblog, and I'm back with Brandon Lightly, and we're going to be doing probably this is part 2 in the series on China, part 4 in our overall series on socialist organization, and I suspect there'll be one more on China before we even get to the National Front, because today we are time limited. So we're talking about New Democracy today, and I think this is the most controversial part of Maoism, but I'm also going to say I think it is Mao's attempt to dialectically sublate a national front and a united front, as well as deal with the two different theories in the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, of which he was not a key member, between Chen Duxiu and what's his face? And the reason why I bring it up, because it does feel like, to me, maybe controversially, that Li Dazhao, who's always the one I forget because he dies so early, but Li Dazhao is where we get the idea of proletarian national identity, which has the unfortunate thing of being developed exactly concurrently to Mussolini doing the same thing in fascism. So by the time you get to 1940, Mao can't do that, but Mao also has to make the distinction between himself and Chen Duxiu, because Chen Duxiu has been forced to take the fall for the KMT. B, by this time he's been deemed a Trotskyist, which he kind of wasn't. And 3, by this time as well, he has become a classical, almost Second International Marxist, believing that the Chinese Revolution has gotten into a problem by prematurely having a revolution. He almost sounds like Trotsky, by prematurely having a revolution and not developing its capitalist forces first, thus getting into. Go ahead.
It reminds me of I think, was it Plekhanov, who was like, we aren't ready for this, and then Lenin essentially having to be like, yeah, but it's happening. I feel like that was it's very similar to that debate that was happening.
Plekhanov and Lenin had a similar debate, and then, although Plekhanov really wasn't alive to finish the debate, and then Kautsky and Trotsky, that's not confusing at all, as proxies basically for Plekhanov and Lenin, have the debate again in a text that eventually gets called On Terrorism, which is very confusing. Or On Terror, excuse me, not terrorism. The argument was that having to do state capitalism, which, by the way, Lenin did endorse as a periodization, would be so brutal that it would lead to all kinds of backlashes. And Trotsky took the opposite side of that. Chen Duxiu basically argues the same thing, although he's forced to take the fall for the first civil war with the KMT and the purges, where the KMT like just massacre communists. I actually find New Democracy interesting because it comes out before the PRC is really established, so it's long doctrine. Even though some Maoists do reject it, it's actually kind of hard to argue about how they reject it. And 2, it feels like, it really does feel like the compromise position between the Chen Duxiu position and the Li Dazhao position. I don't know how to say that name exactly. I'm bad at opinion. Go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like for me at least, working through New Democracy, it was fascinating. Specifically, it's at least I was finding connection points to the Boxer Rebellion, and then like I mean the questionable thing, the controversial aspect of New Democracy is the inclusion of the national bourgeoisie or the patriotic bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
Uh, and like that that like lends itself to a question, is this like a thing? Is this a phenomenon that actually exists? And I feel like you can actually point to a couple different examples that go the other way. You can point to Italy, you can point to Germany after Versailles and everything, and this denigration, this collapse of a national bourgeoisie, and this like national resentment that grows. You can also see it in Spain, in like the Catalonia regions, as Britain is expanding out its textile trade and just destroying in Spain before the Second Republic. Like a lot of people don't realize this. This is like a little bit of a side tangent, but a lot of the revolutionary sentiment in Catalonia that a lot of anarchists will point to during the Spanish Civil War, that is birthed out of a bourgeois aversion to British imperialism that was happening in Spain at the time, because it was like the textile industry was centered around Barcelona and Catalonia, and the textile industry was being destroyed there, and the decolonization movement. So like the Spanish Empire had this whole thing. They were selling essentially to their colonies in order to like keep profits somewhat up, but this was all being destroyed by like British neocolonialism. And so like there's this weird tension that I feel like that existed all across Europe, especially in these like semi-periphery states, like states that were essentially beaten at by some point by France or by Britain, by what became the capitalist empires of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Uh, and China experienced that in a way after the Boxer Rebellion, because they had to remunerate all 8 countries, I think they declared war
Mm-hmm.
on. And so all of this to say is that this idea of like a national patriotic bourgeoisie isn't as far-fetched as like I think a lot of people might realize, even if I think it's still questionable to include them as a revolutionary class.
Well, I mean, to me, they're a revolutionary class when you have a national liberation revolution and you establish a bourgeois state, which Chen Duxiu would have said. The
That's
problem that I
true.
have is this takes the Lenin idea of state capitalism as a necessary means to develop a capitalist revolution didn't happen in an imperialized nation, which is also itself an empire. That's another thing about China that complicates this. National liberation in China was not just national liberation of the Han, and so you have this tension going all the way back to Sun Yat-sen's like soft socialism and the left side of the Guomindang, the KMT, because you had two variant kinds of nationalism in the KMT. You have Han nationalism, you have Sun Yat-sen's nationalism of 5 nations, which is basically a plural nationalism. I find it very funny that Americans have such hard time with discussing plural nationalism, since we are a plural national country.
Yes.
Like we're already that, you idiots. And the 5 categories get expanded, but like the Uyghurs are explicitly mentioned, as are Tibetans, as are I forget all the groups, like the Toisanese, etc., etc., etc. So Chen Duxiu is basically parroting traditional Marxism. Lenin is saying like, oh no, we have to have this anti-imperial stuff, but Lenin never, ever argued that you should put the national bourgeoisie into anything. In fact,
Yeah.
his argument was that the state should step in, in a way that makes Plekhanov roll in his grave, but the state should step in and do that development instead of the bourgeoisie. And that's not what happened in China. And this is a difference between the USSR and China. But I do think we have to talk about traditional, Marxist conceptions, because when we talk about the block of 4 classes, there's some interesting, weird stuff in the block of 4 classes. Traditional Marxist theory implies pretty strict historical stages. Rentier society, or aka feudalism, at least in Europe, we can put a fork in that because Marx does seem to imply that if it happens in Europe, other places like Russia can skip it. But even there, people will sometimes read that as like, whoa, he's saying that you didn't have to go to capitalism. No, he's saying that like the peasant communes could be a basis for workers' communes, because they can join up with the benefits of Western capitalism later. That's the various Sasulik letters implication in the various drafts, of which go ahead.
Oh, a lot of people misconstrue that to be like, we can just skip this stuff, or this is actually the vanguard, and I don't think that's at all what Marx is saying.
No, I mean, well, it's just like how Maoists will say sometimes Maoists believe the lumpen should be the vanguard, and I'm like, they're not even in the block of 4 classes.
Yeah.
They're actually a third thing called the non-hostile class group. The idea of brainwashing, which is a misconstrued idea, actually comes from the re-education of the lumpen to proletarianize them. From
what I understand, I feel like I do feel like it was the Black Panther Party that really, or no, it might have actually been Peru, the actual Marxist that actually like leaned in on the lumpen.
Yeah, well, the only theoretical writings I can think that started doing it early, and by early I still mean you're looking at the 60s.
Yeah.
Is Eldridge Cleaver, because it wasn't even the majority position in the Panthers. The majority position in the Panthers was that you could work with the lumpen, so you could work with street gangs. I think it's the Young Kings that are but that led to some problems later on. Crips, which were never directly tied to the Panthers, but their origins are actually in a group that was inspired by this Panther lumpen idea. The other thing is like, you have all this incorporation of lumpen in this things like the FARC in Colombia.
And we know exactly how it went the exact same way.
Yeah, they basically just become narco gangs.
Yep.
And I know I'm gonna get heat in the comments, but I'm not saying everyone involved became that, but that is primarily what they ended up being.
Yeah, that is the trajectory of the movement itself.
So let's get into this. So, traditional Marxism, particularly of the Second International variety, though, which didn't even acknowledge the Sasulik letter, so we can bracket that out. Says feudalism must be and early modern imperialism must be overthrown by a rising capitalist class and a bourgeois democratic revolution that also is usually a national liberation revolution or a national consolidation revolution, depending on where you're at and what relationship you have to empire, which builds up the industrial productive forces enough to the working class can grow strong enough to overthrow the capitalist in a socialist revolution. There is a distinct problem that like that's actually some not happen anywhere. Mao sat down and decided that this needed to be revised, which is why I love the fact that we call the stuff about Stalin the anti-revisionist debates, because I'm like, no, they were explicitly revising Marxism. Like, it wasn't even hidden. It's weird now that people will try to claim this is like straight up classical orthodox Marxism, but like the Maoists did not initially think so. So like they knew what they were doing. So they Mao and the Politburo changed the sequence into late developing capitalism, late developing nation states, colonialized nation states, and semi-colonialized nations. Eventually, this is going to be the basis for the misunderstanding that leads to three world theory.
Yep.
Although when I tell people when I remind people what the three worlds were, they're often like, "What?" I'm like, "Yeah, it doesn't map onto this actually."
And to be clear, three worlds is different than third worldism, of which there are two different types of third worldism.
At least two different types of third worldism.
Yes.
One I am sympathetic to, one I think is objectively insane. So
yes.
So I am willing to give Mao the benefit of the doubt. I'm also willing to say that this is where there are certain problems that piss Maoist off today. When someone like Black Red Guard says, "Hey, we're the anarchists of Marxism," because I'm like, well, they are though, and people are like, "Oh no, we're not anarchists." I'm like, I'll get to it because it shows up in a block of 4 classes. It's not about the state. It's that is not the issue where they rhyme with anarchist.
Okay, I'm excited for this.
Yeah, so the domestic national bourgeoisie, according to Mao, and the colonial and semi-colonial countries are too weak, fragmented, and dependent on foreign imperial powers to wage a successful, independent democratic revolution against feudalism, which I find interesting because I'm like, but they're not even fighting feudalism; they're fighting imperialism. And Mao thus flips the order of operations. All Marxists, except for the right wing of the Second International. So after the Second International, all Marxists basically believe that imperialism is bad. That comes with Lenin. It's also the majority position in the Second International until World War I. But there were pro-imperial socialists in the Second International. I want to be very clear on that.
Yeah.
That was not Trotsky or Bernstein. It was people to the right of them. Go ahead.
It's fascinating to me that like that this is like framed as a like anti-feudal method that does in fact then incorporate landlords, not into like leadership positions, but like landlords are just explicitly a part of some of the areas that are like run by the party, at least during the Japanese invasion, to the point that there were landlords who would move from the KMT areas because they didn't like the KMT areas a lot into some of the communist run areas.
So that whole thing about Mao killing landlords, they did do that.
Yeah.
That was the only class they were really brutal with, but they also worked with them, depending on the time period that we're talking about. Okay, so the solution is the working class and the peasantry organized through the vanguard Communist Party would step in and lead the bourgeois democratic revolution themselves, but with the bourgeois as part of the coalition. That is the difference between New Democracy and classical Soviet developmental theory. And I do think it needs to be pointed out that is a difference. Like, because while Lenin thought that they had to do the capitalist development, and there's a big debate, in the 1930s about whether or not they achieved that. The end of the NEP is partially based off that. It can't be said to be completely true. Another thing I'm going to actually talk about is when we talk about like China now, this block of 4 classes no longer just includes the patriotic bourgeoisie. It includes all bourgeoisie.
Yeah, there are like, this is how you can have billionaires who are a part of the party.
Which they're not a major part of the party, but they're a part of the party. Yeah. Also, it's how you can justify a country that is communist that has more billionaires than the United States does.
Yes, yeah.
They don't have as many of the super duper rich as the United States does, but yeah.
And they can definitely discipline them better, to be clear.
Yeah, but we used to do that too.
Exactly. This is a bit of a side tangent. This is actually one of my actual like fears about China as it exists right now, is that like its hyper progress, the increase of its living standards, the reintroduction of certain reforms that Xi's been doing, especially in the rural countryside, is not necessarily a part of a like socialist project, but is just China really just embracing the 20th century developmental liberalism that the United States and the general West has completely abandoned at this point. And so it's like, oh, we're looking at this is China's Fordism. And so will there be a thing that comes after China's Fordism?
Yeah, I've actually said that. I'm like, it's basically the development. It's not even European social democracy. It's basically a step above Fordism. And the other difference is they don't want to generate domestic demand. And we can talk about, like, that's a different problem, but it actually is a problem. It's one of the pro-China MMTers are always baffled by this. So
but that was a side tangent. Yeah.
Yeah. To stay with New Democracy a bit. The resulting state would not be a capitalist democracy, which Mao, of course, termed old democracy, nor would it be a Soviet-style dictatorship of the proletariat or a dictatorship of the proletariat and peasant, depending on which time period we're talking about. It would be a joint dictatorship of all the revolutionary classes as an acting step towards socialism, basically achieving a united front, but as a joint dictatorship, which I think, to use a term from William Bullman, who was not a communist at all, but pours acid on the classical definition of communism. Because I'm like, not only is that class collaborationist, that's not a dictatorship of the proletariat. That's a national dictatorship.
Yeah.
So let's talk about who's in the block of four classes, because this is also, and this is where I talk about the anarchist stuff, gonna get really interesting. So visually immortalized by the four small stars on the flag. That's why there's 4 stars.
Yep.
The
big one is the party.
Yeah, the big one is the party, and then the 4 stars are the various classes. By the way, there is weird symbolism to all these AES countries, and like the two that get defended a lot, Jusei and the PRC. And I have a lot of good things to say about the PRC. I'm a defensist against liberals for the most part, but like I'm always like, there's always classes on these signs that tell you that they've accepted classes that were not part of the Marxist thing. And I find it interesting that this is like not dealt with. I mean, this is where Domenico Lacerdo and all that stuff comes in, but I just actually think that ends up being more than a little bit problematic. So Mao argued that because foreign imperialism and rural backwardsness, I'm not going to say feudalism because it's not really what we're dealing with, actually.
Yeah.
Oppressed a broad swath of society, a united front can be formed amongst the key progressive groups, and they would jointly serve in the dictatorship. So there's the proletariat, which is the industrial working class, which is the ideological and leading force. There's the peasantry, which are the rural agricultural population, and that was the main base of the CPC. Which was acting as a primary physical engine of the revolution through agrarian land reform and through, being most of the people who actually fought. I will remind people, however, that Mao thought that the peasantry was the most revolutionary force, even though they weren't supposed to be in charge of things in communism. There are the urban petit bourgeois, not the rural petit bourgeois. Small business owners, artisans, intellectuals. They include students in this, which I am always like, I don't know how that works. Like,
okay, this actually answers a question that I've had about like being called petit bourgeois before, like when I was in college. I was like, oh, okay, this actually makes sense now. All right, this is the ideological tradition you're pulling from.
Right. Well, it's the everyone I don't like is petit bourgeois. Artisans and small business owners are petit bourgeois.
Yes.
Intellectuals are more difficult depending on the structure of your society. So, like the intellectual.
I was about to say, like in China, like the intellectual, like that is a class. Like the intellectual,
that is a class.
It's a full ass class in a way that like doesn't exist in the West except maybe like priests, but I don't. That it's not even true today. It was like at one point, I guess you could point at the church as maybe a semi-intellectual class, but even then they were more it's more of a reactionary element than, at least it's been historically more. I'm not sure
the intellectuals weren't reactionary, because this is one of the problems that come up in the Cultural Revolution.
That's a good point.
Like that's a specific subset of the urban petite bourgeoisie that Mao feels like they have to deal with. And then there's the national bourgeoisie as opposed to the comprador bourgeoisie. I get told comprador bourgeoisie is like in classical Marxism. Like, no, it isn't. The word is Portuguese. It comes explicitly from China. And it was a way to talk about the people who relied on international trade in such a way that they had to make deals with imperial governments and outside state parties. Whereas the national bourgeoisie were generally middle market, domestic capitalist, who were pissed off at foreign monopolies and bureaucratic capitalism, which were elites tied to either the Chen dynasty or to foreign powers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to say that contra-board distinction isn't Marxist, because I'm not one of those people who thinks we can limit Marxism to what was said by Marx, but it is not part of orthodox Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
It gets added later because of specific conditions in Asia. But I get real fun. I laugh like hell when people start talking about applying that category to the United States. I'm like, they're all comprador.
Yeah.
I will say that when you also remember that Mao thought this only made sense in colonized and semi-colonized nations, not even late developing ones.
Mm-hmm.
This is slightly more defensible.
Yeah, this is the thing you always have to give Mao, is that like at no point was Mao like, this is the worldwide tradition that we need to embrace. Like the United States needs to embrace this this framework is never a thing that was uttered by Mao.
But I actually do think that the Popular Front, and then in the 60s, Americans trying to approximate the block of four classes in the developed world is where the ability of left populism and Marxism to merge emerges from.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
This was something that I almost put in my book with Daniel Tutton, and decided that like it would be longer to prove this than the 80 to 90 page book that we wrote. So I was like, okay, well, I'll come back to this later. It is like a footnote.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about this political and economic features and practice. And this is where things get a little even more weird. But the idea, the reason why I say that like Maoism has an almost anarchistic core is Proudhon, the mutualists, the Magonists don't do this, but the Zapatas and the Zapatistas original edition, although actually the modern edition also does this, actually, sees the peasantry as the most revolutionary part of society. Communizers will often talk about that. The problem that you have, though, is in Europe, the peasantry was reactionary as fuck. Like, who's the war in the Vendée in the French Revolution fought against? It's not aristocrats. Like,
yeah.
And this was something that Bukharin even defended. Like, he would talk about like the reason why the peasants were reactionary is because they were rightly mad at the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie was leading the liberal revolution, so they'd identify the king as a counterforce to that. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, historically, though, that's what peasants' revolts have always done, is revolt against local lords and local governmental authorities by appealing to the king. And they normally get fucked. Like,
that's literally what the German, like, Engels wrote about it, but like, and I don't think Engels was 100% right. I think he glorified it a little bit, but like, the German peasants' revolt was this as well. It was literally the exact same thing. And people will point to it as a potentially revolutionary action, but then you actually look at the things that were written, and it's like hyper-patriarchal. It was like, we need to establish a new like, a lot of them were like, we just need to like appeal to the king. A lot of other ones were like, we just need to get a new king. A lot of other ones were just like, that's not the case that they were like hyper-revolutionary.
They are pushing for different conditions. They're not pushing for a fundamental change in society.
Yeah.
And we're not saying that they shouldn't push for different conditions. I mean, my God, those conditions sucked. But like, nonetheless. So the other thing Mao does is you start getting some of the first writings on culture outside of the USSR here. So you had the pro-cult debates, and then the debates about communist aesthetics, and then the social realism debate. But this is actually kind of very different, because Mao talking about the need for national, scientific, and mass cultures, and those are not the same thing for him. It's a whole section of that essay, but that one needed to purge foreign imperial influence, and old feudal superstitions altogether, which is part of why the irony about post Zemin love of Confucianism and the claim that 2,000 years of Confucianism was necessary to make China the most substitute for communism are essentially Chinese rightist claims, and Westerners don't understand the context and thus like will sometimes parrot them without
Confucianism
realizing.
was. Oh no, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm saying like Confucianism was so unpopular that even before like the communists came around, there were a lot of like intellectuals and members of the bourgeoisie and members of the proletariat who are like, we need to fucking do something about this.
I mean,
even before the warlord period, I think. Was it before the warlord period?
Confucianism was so maligned in Korea, which in some ways is more Confucian than China, even though Confucianism is a Chinese religio-philosophical ideology. But Korean Neo-Confucianism is even stricter than any form of Chinese Confucianism. But it was so unpopular that like that's why there was mass defections in the North to Christianity before there were mass defections in communism. But anyway, so that claim is funny to me.
And it's coming back. It's coming back. I don't know what social media algorithm you're on, but I've seen a lot, like in the last like 2 weeks even, I've just seen like a mass of just
I've seen a lot
talking about this.
Dipshit American communists not even realizing that they're picking sides with Han nationalists against the fucking Xi government because they don't understand what they're reading, even though it's being said in English, because they're like they don't get the argument really. And I'm like, yeah, God, this is what happens when you're politicized by fucking memes, instead of either learning our material conditions. Although arguably material conditions are why the memes are popular. But anyway, new democracy was supposed to be a temporary conditional phase. By 1956, the CPC determined that the immediate goals of consolidation, basic land redistribution, and economic stabilization have been met. The state transitioned to socialist transformation, which was supposedly finished in 1982, although you still hear it brought up today. I say supposedly finished because it's in the Chinese Constitution, which I do think people should read. But then I read Politburo statements by everybody but Deng after that, and they're all claiming we're still going through socialist transformation and building the necessary preconditions for full socialism. So yeah, the other thing that you see with the Soviets were often likely to change definitions so they could declare that they reach stuff faster. The Chinese tend to like, oh, it's protracted people's war. We can fight this for 100 years. And, you know, it might be a millennium before we achieve full communism or whatever. Like this is a Chinese tactic, which I've always been a little bit, you know, for all the good stuff we said about Mao last time, this is where you're going to hear me go like, I am for a strategy of patience, but that patience should not be millennial. Anyway, so
I do wonder how much, because Three Worlds theory was also like explicitly developed around the same time that like new democracy was supposed to have been like we achieved it, and the Sino-Soviet split is like actively, depending on where you like put the like the final like pin in the coffin. I feel like the Sino-Soviet split is actively like happening at this point, and I'm genuinely curious how much of like this new democracy framework is almost a shoring up. It's like a shoring up of resources, becoming a little bit more like socialism in one country-esque, even though, or new democracy in one country. I don't know, because China was never, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think China was ever as big about exporting the revolution as even the Soviet Union was during its revisionist period.
They have never been big on exporting the revolution. Part of that I think has to do with Kampuchea or Cambodia. Because that's one of the few times they tried to export it. But the other thing is like basically after the Comintern's disbanded, and also because the Chinese are rightfully bitter that the KMT were chosen to represent the Chinese nation in the Comintern and not the actual Communist Party.
Yeah,
Which that doesn't remain true forever, but it's in the beginning. There's a strong bitterness towards that, and I think you see this today. And like the Chinese belief that national determination trumps basically the expanding revolution,
mm-hmm.
which I've always said that they might have argued that like Stalin might have argued for socialism in one country off of Bukharin, but I don't actually think that he really believed that it was possible forever. Given that he did try to expand communism,
Yeah,
uh, the Chinese might actually because their foreign policy in the 70s in particular, at the end of the collected period and the Cultural Revolution and all that, is almost impossible to explain if you think you need an international to make this viable.
totally.
But anyway, so let's talk about this. So we mentioned the four classes. The peasantry is the most revolutionary. The proletariats are who are going to actually run communism. The peasantry is basically encouraged to slowly self-abolish, which, to be fair, they mostly have done. Not entirely. The Chinese peasantry is still pretty large and still pretty poor.
Mm-hmm.
But Xi's like popularity in China was that's like I've told people is sincere. It's because unlike even Hu Jintao, who said they were going to finally bring some social democratic reforms into China, Xi at least did it for the peasantry, reversing some of Deng's liberalization, and that doesn't get talked a lot about. But that's part of reasons why, like, I've had people who hate Deng, like Deng Pinghan, come on and play Xi, is because the reversal of the extent of liberalization in the countryside.
Yeah,
But I, like you, often sometimes think that's just establishing like early United States levels of maybe more than that, but like it's still crazy, for example, how privatized the Chinese healthcare system is. And
total. Yeah,
um they until like 2021 it was as privatized as the United States. Now it's slightly better if you're really poor, but yeah. Uh, so where does this show up? Well, the United Front's never formally abandoned, and believe it or not, this block of four classes is manifested in things like the 8 Democratic parties that are approved to have lower coalitionary roles in the government. They can't run the government, but they can have some form of coalition.
mm-hmm.
There's also something that I think would make Mao really deeply angry, which is, or definitely Marx. Marx would be furious about this. The CPPCC, in English, I don't know what the hell it would be in Chinese, which is Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is basically the business federations. Yes, China has business federations and civic groups, the equivalent to NGOs in our society, all get together and they have a consultative conference to work with the party so that the party maintains a balance with non-communist technocrats and private sector leaders, to keep them on board.
And
Um,
I think there's a lot of people, even like liberal political scientists included, who try to like make like a hard separation between like the Mao period and then Deng and then Xi. And
mhm,
the problem with this is that like what you're describing right here is kind of what was set up in Shanghai when the communists first came in, just because they didn't have the resources to fully manage these like large businesses. And so what
mhm,
they did is they literally set up like a proto version of these councils of these business interests, like they had worker interests involved as well, but it was essentially these like this consultative council that would then like work with the party to make sure taxes were being paid, that like people weren't being like hired under the table and stuff like that. But it was like two independent groups as like a collaborative relationship almost.
Yeah.
And that was going back to Mao, so it's hard to make these like distinctive lines and a lot of at least American American like academics try to make.
But I will say it makes sense why Hoxhaists consider Maoist revisionist when you think about this.
Yes.
Like
100%.
For those of you who don't know, Hoxhaists are the super Stalinists. Like they considered it's the Albanians. They considered the USSR to be revisionist after Khrushchev and the secret siege. But they also considered Mao to be revisionist because they're like, what's all this other crap you're incorporating? It has nothing to do with anything even Stalin said. What's up with you?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you ever wonder why Hoxhaists get all mad at Maoist, this is why. Even though they both hated Trotskyist and the Soviet Union. I get the feeling that weirdly everybody hated the Soviet Union after 1952, which makes the current Lacerda Rock Hill thing where they're trying to focus on the CIA messing with Western academics. I bring this up a lot, but it really does interest me because it feels like we are trying to make the Sino-Soviet split go away. I talked about this in Carlos Garrido's book. Back before Midwestern Marx was part of the ACP and a lot of Marxist-Leninists took them seriously. And I was like, he's like saying we should support the USSR and Vietnam and Cambodia. You can't.
Yeah, you can't do that. That's not how that, yeah.
I mean, you can now because half those things don't still exist. But at the time, there was no way to do that.
Mm-mm.
And if you want to talk about what broke up intellectuals in the fights in the New Left, and Europe and the United States, it wasn't over the fucking Frankfurt School. It was over the Sino-Soviet split. And we know the CIA utilized that because the COINTELPRO documents from the CPUSA and the RCP and the SDS have been released. You can read books on them. I've even read some of them directly. They went in and played up the Sino-Soviet split, knowing that it was a legitimate port or division. So it's anyway.
I'll even say I feel like if we're getting to the point of like the academics are split on this, it's like I don't think you had a Marxist movement at that point. If that's the thing that you think destroyed the movement.
Yeah, I said that too. If the academics can destroy all of communism, you have at a time when only 20% of the population went to college, you have a much larger problem than you're admitting.
Yeah, you're actually admitting to a huge issue that we're just not addressing, I guess.
Right. But anyway, so you would think then, was the incorporation of the national bourgeoisie over after the end of the formal new democracy period, which was formally ended in 1953? And the answer to that is no, the fuck it wasn't.
No.
So one, the Chinese bourgeoisie, the national bourgeoisie gets resurrected as a primary concern under Deng. Once the Gang of Four lose, it's pretty much you see this thought come back in. And then when you have the Three Represents period under Jiang Zemin, which is in 2001, the party codified the inclusion not just the CPPCC, that's fun as fuck to say, but also into the party itself. So private entrepreneurs could now join the Communist Party. The Three Represents doctrine stated that the party must represent the development trends of China's advanced productive forces, even within the party itself. So even though it is true, I don't believe that the PMC are a class, so you could argue that these are mostly workers, but it is actually true that the PRC is mostly engineers and lawyers,
Mm-hmm.
meaning and lawyers in the Chinese context are not petit bourgeois in the way that rich lawyers are in America. So my friend who does believe in PMC theory would be like, the funny thing about China is it's an actually existing PMC government.
I
Go
will say
ahead.
PMC feels like an attempt for Marxists or leftists, because they both subscribe to it, certain types, to incorporate some kind of like intellectia, like intellectual class as like a thing, when it doesn't exist. I'm not a proponent of PMC. I sometimes call it a professional managerial strata, but like it's not a class in the way that like the intellectual class was a thing in China.
It comes up. Nicholas Palancis pulls this stuff because Palancis is actually echoing the Maoists without realizing it, being Althusserian, and Althusserians are all crypto Maoists, or not so crypto Maoists. Depending on who you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I actually do think there is a rational core in the United States of thinking about professionals as a PMC being proletarianized formation. And that today we can talk about the professional managerial strata because there's a strata that is labor aristocratic in the working class, a word that no one likes, but it's accurate. And then there's a strata that is petit bourgeois still. But that petit bourgeois strata is smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Those are people who can actually like own their own practices. It's just less and less of that. And after
Yeah.
AI, I don't think it's going to exist. I think it's going to be gone.
Yeah.
So
This strata can essentially be defined as people who are like hyper proletarianizing, and whose children will probably be like making less than they are.
right.
Like that's the way that I understand the strata to exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is similar to the urban petit bourgeois shop owners who have mostly been, busted up outside of certain areas. That does not mean there still aren't plenty of petit bourgeois. In fact, one of the interesting side effects of neoliberalism was a expansion of the petit bourgeois. But
And with the decadence of neoliberalism, the petit bourgeois is always reactionary, but the hard reactionary turn of a lot of the petit bourgeois.
yeah, I mean, we'll talk about the problems with this. But I did one of the reasons why Daniel and I went back and forth about whether the PMC are a class, and I think he will sometimes use the word class. I will never use it for the PMC because I cannot, and I don't just mean it from the standpoint of productive forces, although I definitely mean it there. I also mean when I use liberal notions of class, it doesn't make sense either because there's no income variance or singular habitus that defines it. And when people talk about it, particularly the Confin Lus of the world, Comrade Lou is acquaintance of mine and not an enemy, but like you're talking about like mostly about the culture of academia, which everyone goes through, but you ignore that like fire is all tied into that. That's real estate and engineering. You ignore that all large corporations, including industrial ones, have managers, often who are not at all concerned about the cultural concerns of the humanities department at a California university. And so you realize that the people are yelling about the PMC are just mad at themselves because they're also all from that strata.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is self-violence and self-erasure. You're like, there's this class of which, I mean, I remember listening to Amber Frost say she was not PMC, and me go, you worked at fucking NYU, and you are literally not even all that petite bourgeois. You are a bourgeois rentier off of your participation in Chapo Trap House, one of the most lucrative podcasts that has ever existed.
Yeah,
What the fuck are you on?
PMC is all of my peers who I work with, but not me.
Right. Because of half of my family at birth. But anyway.
Yes.
So New Democracy permitted private capital to develop the nation's infrastructure with state oversight and partial state control. You will see defense of this. I'm doing a whole behind the Patreon thing about Chinese state ownership, because people got mad at me when I said that like the NEP was radically different than the current situation, because I'm like, China only owns 20% or so of IPO trading directly, and in the NEP under Bukharin, 70% of the entire economy was owned by the government.
Mm-hmm.
Like, including all commanding heights.
And the method of expropriation was also different. And like in a lot of cases with especially the patriotic bourgeoisie that they wanted to incorporate into the new democracy, it wasn't just expropriated. It was they were still partial owners of a lot of these large companies, and they were bought out by the party, which is just that's just a different way of expropriating. Not adding any judgment either way, but that is different.
I mean, it's similar to what social democracies did.
Yeah.
And to be fair, I mean, the Chinese did not have a Kulak rebellion and have to go and kill 2% of the population or whatever.
I do feel like I have to keep coming back to this because like I'm pretty critical of new democracy. I'm pretty critical of like how this formed up and the class collaboration of it all. And then I also have to sit back, and I'm also a China defensist when it comes to liberals, because I have to sit back and be like, well, China exists, and a lot of the other projects that I'm referring to no longer exist. So there has to be some kind of reckoning with that, at least to a certain point.
This is the other Lacerda move through his love of Hegel's philosophy of writing, saying that Marx was wrong about that. I love that, and this is going to piss a lot of people off who I don't think people listen to the show much, but I was going to say it outright. Domenico Lacerda is third worldist in a small capacity, because Deng is third worldist, and his argument that communists should just give up the idea of getting rid of markets. The government. I mean, the state, excuse me, not any form of government, even Marx and things like that. Classes. He does actually say that we're not, we should give up on the abolition of classes. And I'm like, you're not a communist. You're a fucking liberal. Despite all your anti-liberal posturings, you actually fundamentally believe that what communism is to do is just liberal development to bring the real promise of early liberalism out, except for the developing world.
Yeah.
And people are like, oh, it's communism for the developing world. And these are the same people who tell me that somehow the fucking most productive society on the planet is still in the developing world.
That society still claims it's in the developing world too.
Yeah. That's real funny. No,
that's a fair point though. I think those are the two things that I'm constantly balancing when it comes to China, is like, but they exist, but also, do they exist? It's a constant back and forth of like, is this actually a project that we should be learning lessons from?
I am very torn on China, because on one hand, I don't want 12-hour work days 6 days a week. On the other hand, they did capitalist developmentalism better than anybody else, including the imperial core. They do seem to care about their population in ways that we don't. But again, to me, I'm like, but that's just like competent nationalism, which we're just not like.
Exactly.
Our nationalism's all fake. Like, so like what people like, what do you mean? I'm like, nobody who's actually leading the nationalist charge in America gives a shit about the components of the American nation.
Yes.
Like, that's why they're always propping up fucking. I mean, like, I was telling someone this the other day. I was like, I'm not a jingoist, but have you ever looked at how many of these tech oligarchs that MAGA pops up aren't even Americans? Like, they're not even naturalized Americans.
Yeah.
Like, but anyway, that's a rant. So. This does ties to the United Front, because the United Front does call for a union of with with bourgeois parties, but refusing to let them control the government, which you could argue that the CCPPC is an example of. The problem that you have, though, is in United Front logic, historically, that only applies before the revolution.
Yeah.
Or in defense of national liberation. It's not supposed to apply 30, 40 years after the nation has received. So, like, again, I can kind of, in a very rough way, given the conditions that China existed in and Mao not wanting, they already lost enough people to famine.
Yeah.
Mao not wanting to like lead a civil war, basically. Well, again.
Also, there were like 3 within like a 40-year period that were the 3 largest civil wars in world history, right before the communist revolution. So like I can understand.
Yeah. I mean, you know, that's also like when I was like, even during the worst part of the Great Leap Forward, life expectancy was still better than it was during the 3 civil war periods prior. Yep. So like, yeah, maybe there's a reason. So I'm not saying that. It also led to some weird resentment because of like the caste system that develops in China in the 50s is tied to the hukou. Because your class origin starts being really important and maintains with you throughout your life, which became part of the one of the big backlashes against Mao in the Thousand Flowers period that the anti-riots campaigns really aimed to stamp out was complaints about that. But a lot of people are like, that's not Marxism. Like, you're not supposed to, like, once you have liquidated that class, which you chose not to do, but their children aren't really part of it, why are you maintaining it like this?
Yeah.
And, you know, it is an interesting problem. So the block of 4 classes and the mass line were the 2 big parts of early Maoist political strategy tied into national revolution. You can also see this with the with what they call the inversion of the primary contradiction. And the reason why that's important for Maoists, and the reason why this is important today, and I'm not going to get into this debate. This might be another series, because I unfortunately do take a modified version of the classical Marxist position that while imperialism does exist before capitalism, it is not the primary contradiction of which capitalism is subsidiary. Mm-hmm. The existence of capitalism changes the meaning of imperialism, its function, and its operations, just like it changed the meaning of rents, their function and operations. Yeah. So the argument about whether or not imperialism only happens before capitalism or after capitalism is relevant to me. It's different depending on where you're at and what it's doing. Otherwise, we wouldn't need the theories of imperialism to explain anything, and we could just talk about like colonialism and be done with it. So I guess people have said that sounds like a compromise between the classical and the Maoist position.
Oh,
but
really?
The thing is, yeah, because I do admit that like imperialism predates capitalism.
That's
but it's not the Maoist position. It's actually, to be quite frank, it is closer to both the Stalin and Trotskyist position. And I know people aren't going to like that I said that they have the same side on this, but they do. And one of the funny things about that is, as a Rob Ashlar said on Twitter once, the thing about the Soviet Union is, unlike China, it was actually existing third worldism because they were using national liberation as their primary means of expansion, and China wasn't. And so, like, which is pretty fucking funny.
That's wild.
I mean, that's the kind of thing that you would expect from Ashlar, because it's going to piss everybody off. But I do think it's interesting. One thing you could say about particularly when combined with the collectivization period, the block of 4 classes mixed with the mass line did mean that you had more national cohesion in China than you did elsewhere. It's something that Michael Sandel, actually, the American communitarian philosopher, worries about, because he's worried that once the leadership from the collective period dies, and that's like after Xi, because she was involved in the collective period.
Yeah.
That the class collaboration that you see in China is going to go away. Because it is mainly maintained by memory of people who are now very old.
Yeah. I feel like the actual reality in China right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a lot more stratified than one would imagine.
Oh yeah, it's very stressful. They're happier with their nation than we are, but like it's very
totally,
stratified.
Yeah.
I mean, they have a bunch of billionaires, which I mean, you know, like
that means there must be like a lot of poverty.
Right. All right. So the mass line is really important for the functioning of New Democracy, and for the block of four classes, and for the three represent, and we've talked about the definition of the mass line, but part of the reason why it's important here is that the party was supposed to basically build a national culture that could combine the interest and vocabularies and slogans of all kinds of different people. Something that I could say that the Soviets and, God forbid, Western communists are incredibly shitty at. Even though, despite everyone complaining that it's liberal now because they don't know shit, we invented code switching. No, I mean, we didn't invent it, but we codified it as a concept. That's Stuart Hall. That's Marxist. And the Maoists did too, because the Maoists actually spent a long time trying to come up with a way to get the proletarian vision distributed to everybody of different economic interests, vocabularies, and worldviews. And while I'm not nearly as collaboration, in fact, if you tell me we should incorporate the national bourgeoisie in the United States, I'm basically like, I'll kick you out of the train.
The tent is not that big.
Yeah. Although, I mean, I guess it is that big, because if you look at what most people actually want who call themselves socialist, it's basically not even this.
Yeah. That's, I feel like I had a long conversation about that last year. I was having a conversation. I was like, if you picked up your average socialist in the United States and dropped them into Switzerland, they would be completely placated.
Right.
Switzerland, notoriously the most expensive country in Europe.
Right.
And hyper-isolationist and right-wing.
You know, I just find it very... They'd also probably be okay in Singapore.
Yeah, totally.
So
Singapore, the Switzerland of
Asia.
Yeah.
By the way, New Democracy was something that a lot of New Democracy and Vanguard Partyism was, and 5-year plans were something that a lot of the right of Asia actually adopted for national unification.
Oh wow.
Like explicitly, like the National Front in Singapore, the second dictatorship in Korea, they all used it.
I mean, that's similar to how like the Birch Society picked up vanguardism.
Right. I mean, but they did not use Western developmental patterns. They used Soviet developmental patterns, which I also think you see even in right-wing governments in the developing world today. But so the mass line gives you a way to part of the function of the mass line that makes the merger thesis a little bit more viable. You and I are going to write an article about this, actually.
Yeah.
Is that it really did try to code switch from people in these different classes, but also in different sectors of these classes. So like they knew the like industrial workers and like shopkeepers and like farm, like agrarian labor who were not tenant farmers, but actually paid. They had massively different educational attainment levels, massively different socialization. And they also, this is one of the things that we talked about last time, on cultural stuff, Mao was pretty progressive, particularly on gender, actually, compared to traditional Chinese society. I mean, he did some things that make some feminists uncomfortable, including killing a bunch of female communists during the 40s. But in general, he was not Mao was not particularly big on killing other communists, despite the way he's portrayed in Western media. That's just not true. He critiqued Stalin for it. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
And also importantly, you can see some of this is almost a reaction to not having the bloodshed of the 30s in China after 3 civil wars.
Mm-hmm.
Mao thought that the mass line would be a way to sublate the contradictions among the people, which means that this block of 4 classes that makes new democracy possible is only possible through the mass line. And while I'm pretty open to trying to win over parts of the petite bourgeoisie, I think a lot of it is proletarianized anyway. One of the things I tell people is I don't want to remove the PMS. I want to subordinate that strata. I want its skills to be spread out. And particularly now that it's being assaulted by technology too, through the possibility of AI, although it's still not really effective at doing it, but nonetheless, it still costs a lot of jobs. The reason why this was really important is Mao really seemed, and I know this sounds crazy to a lot of Westerners who've been propagandized, but Mao seemed to really want to avoid having to explicitly kill a whole bunch of Chinese or communists.
Yeah.
When people talk about Mao's death count, it's like attributing famines to him. That is not to say that the CPC never killed anyone. Oh, hell yeah, they did. It was wartime, and they did even after. It is not to say that even during the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution that people weren't executed by the state. But by and large, you will find that the actual executed by the state numbers are much smaller than you think.
Yeah.
The death tolls... Go ahead.
Oh, I think China is a perfect example of the industrializing a country kills a lot of people, and that's what you can learn. Is like you see the same, like you see actually higher per capita death rates as as the UK isn't, or not the UK, I think it was Britain at that point, or the British Empire. The British Empire is industrializing. You see like higher per capita death rates. It's just industrialization kills people. That is a thing that we know that happens, and it's hard to ascribe that to a communist.
I mean, I always thought the Yusuf China comes from 3 things. One, there was the purging of most of the upper party membership to consolidate power. That was real. Sorry, people.
Yeah, that was real.
2, that unleashes social forces that no one can control. So people, and Stalin was obsessed with actually bourgeois legal norms. Like all this stuff had to happen legally, unlike the Nazis. Actually, it is something interesting about Stalin. He did not, only in like the forest massacres and the stuff in Poland did stuff really get outside of formal legal apparatuses. But because you had quotas, which is something that should always go up, when people start putting quotas on crimes, you're like, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
But because they had quotas and because there was so much national trauma, not just from the revolution, but just in general.
Yeah.
A lot of interpersonal score settling was done, and I find it weird that like Paul Cockshott and a bunch of other people will use this to defend Stalin, and there's some truth in it. But I'm also of the like, let's quit pretending that Stalin was the big bad that ruined everything, because the problems are larger than that. But once you unleash social forces where people can get revenge, they do. And so,
I mean, this is the terrors. There were terrors after the civil, like I think we talked about this last time. Is like there's, after a revolutionary period when these social forces are unleashed, there's a terror, and a lot of work. And I think we see the documents today. And I'm not trying to be like a full apologist for anything, but we've seen the documents today that like a lot of even work in the Cultural Revolution was actually a work to like tamp down on the terrors that were happening.
Right, because they were civil terrors. What that
Yeah.
means is the settling of civil and social
Mhm.
scores that could be put in class times, but like in China, a lot of them were ethnic, even
Yeah.
like with these sub nationalities killing each other.
Mhm. There was a ton of built up resentment for like the Manchu and
Right. And by the way, we had that too. We had our own terrors in America. We don't talk that much about it. That's why a lot of people went to Canada.
yeah.
I'm not saying like I'm not. This is the other thing. You and I actually will just say like, national consolidation is a lot more violent than you guys want to admit. And it's a lot more ugly than you guys want to admit. And there's
Mhm.
like there might be ways around it, but I'll be damned if I exactly know how if you're gonna enter the world of nations.
Yeah.
Um um
This is partially why a lot of Marxists just kind of like don't want to deal with the national question, I think.
Yeah, or they just want to be like it's good, except like when you do bad stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm like, but you have to do bad stuff. Like,
yeah.
there's no way not to do bad stuff. Like I can't think of a national consolidation project that didn't fuck around with nomadic and pastoral peoples, aka the indigenous.
Yeah.
I literally can't think of any.
Mhm.
Like, sometimes that's undone later, like in Bolivia.
Mhm. Yeah.
But I can't think of where it didn't happen at all. Um, but anyway, and this is not me justifying it. This is me being a descriptive realist. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, again, like I
so
don't think either of us are being apologists for any. I think we're just trying to like describe a thing that happened and why it happened compared to this person is an evil person.
well, yeah. One of the things that makes people mad about me is I've turned lumpinization into a verb because I think it's incoherent as even a social category. It definitely fucking isn't a class.
Mhm.
Um, but because I see lumping characteristics in all classes now that isn't separate enough to be called like its own cohesive parasitic class. The other thing I will say is like my answer for the lumpen is not, if you're going to consider them a coherent class group, which again, I don't. And I'm hearing crazy stuff now, like see Maoists in America talking about how the disabled who have jobs are somehow lumpen. And I'm like, lumpen doesn't mean basically in German it just means trashy.
Mhm.
But it doesn't mean even for Marx's examples, which about just anyone who has been marginalized. It means people who, because of the decomposition of their class position, are now having to use either the state or violence, usually from people who are from the same class strata that they used to be from, to survive.
Mhm.
And like, who do like the classic conservative thing is who do the gangs terrorize? It's not white people, which is actually pretty true. So the Maoist answer to that before the Panthers was like, we're not going to kill these people, which Lenin joked about, but I didn't actually do. Most of the time, we're not going to kill these people. We're going to try to proletarianize them, and that's and so you have the schools for the non-hostiles. That's where it comes
Mhm.
from. And they were basically the parts of what you might call the highly lumpenized declasse people, of which Mao was himself part of. He wasn't a
Mhm.
lumpen, but he was declasse. He was the educated son of a mid-sized farm-owning peasant.
Mhm.
And literally, I do find this funny. Literally, some of the distinctions between mid-sized, which is okay, and large, which is not okay, holding peasant and landlord was based off of Mao's own family. Like, but anyway, so I guess today what you see is this focus on whole process people's democracy is itself a legacy of new democracy. Um, the difference is, and this is where the great debates over whether China is socialist or not, which is something where I take the very unsatisfying position, is I think a lot of China really is trying to transition to socialism still.
Mm-hmm.
But in no world could you call it socialist in the sense that it's actually abolishing classes or even owns the commanding heights of production as a state. They just
Mm-hmm.
don't. They might have a lot of leverage that no one in the West has, even in the social democratic sector. But like, at best, you could argue somehow they're still in some kind of like new democratic.
They're in like a holding territory, I think.
National dictatorship holding territory, and even that. I mean, like the national dictatorship is wrong because, in some ways, China is very democratic. In some ways, it's not, which is like true for every fucking democracy that exists.
This is my rant on democracy. If we start it now, I won't stop talking for 45 minutes.
You and I have to talk about, like, I've become more pro-democracy, but like everyone gets mad at me because I'm like, one of the things about being pro-democracy is pointing out that like almost everything everybody calls democracy wouldn't meet any classical definition of it.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's even including the fact the classical definition was still very tiny and like only like 5% of any state was even part of it, even when it was direct. Mm-hmm. So like, anyway, so you have, I mean, one of the things that you have with China today is you have bureaucratic feedback loops, local partitioning systems, highly for such a centralized state, for a democratically centralized state, they actually have a very highly provincial system. Like there's massive difference between the different provinces and like the way they implement policies. But like you have algorithmic monitoring of public sentiment on social media, you have consumer satisfaction tracking, like it's not just for control, it's also so that they can like try to figure out how to serve the people, which is not, we do all that shit and it's just for control. So I'm like, I am sort of like, I want people to be clear, as much as we've been critical of China today, and there's parts of it I would not necessarily want, but like, if given a choice today to be born in the United States or I don't know, Guangzhou, I'd probably choose Guangzhou.
Yeah.
So, you know, just keep that up. So I want to talk about the critiques real fast, other than ours. And then we can, and I'm gonna let you talk about it. So there's the Trotskyist critique, which is permanent revolution, which everybody calls is premature, although it does actually come from Marx.
It's the problem with a lot of Trotsky critiques. They are there. You can find them. You can trace the logic.
Yeah, I mean, like the thing is about Trotskyists is they're like dogmatic ultra Marxists in some ways, but also not, because eventually Trotskyism splinters in its various rigid ways into replicating the entire spectrum that exists in every other communist group. Maoism does that too, so you know, don't get all pissy.
Yeah, the joke is that there are 9 Trotskyist groups with 8 Trotskyists.
Right. So the classical line, which is also called which was something that both the Mensheviks and the Marxist-Leninists actually maintained after Stalin came to power, is the country must go through a democratic revolution and a capitalist stage to set up its economy. Now, what made the socialism in one country different is the idea that you could do that with communist leadership without a bourgeoisie, but you still need to go through that development. The Menshevik line is like it needs to be democratic and capitalist. The Bolshevik line is that it can be managed by the party, and the party should be democratic internally. Ish. But nonetheless. And I say ish because there's a lot of changes to rules after the Civil War that get implemented by everybody that don't work for anything but terror cells. Which is, you know, this is something that like Donald Parkinson of Cosmonaut and I agree on, because we're always like, yeah, the post-Civil War Soviet like the Bolsheviks' internal constitution, not the constitution of the USSR, but like only really works in a situation where you're under siege. And yeah, they were always under siege externally, but like it actually hurt certain other doctrines over time, and it does not export. Like because it's a way, like if you think about it in a non-wartime footing, it's a way to establish like a clique that just runs everything into the ground really quickly. Which you see both in Trotsky. I mean, Maoists are actually the most flexible in getting rid of it, ironically. But anyway, so just because it's always funny that people think that Trotskyists would somehow argue that imperialism is good because of the social democratic disciples of Max Shachtman going that direction in the 60s.
But, I feel like consistently, I don't know why this is the lane that I took, but I feel like I've taken a lot of people will like take the information that they had and then work back from there. So they work through those debates. I'm just now coming into like the Shachtman debates, and I'm just like, this is not the Trotskyism that I knew what was. And like it's reframing a lot of conversations I've had with Trotskyists, but it's just interesting to me that I'm like, I guess I went like the long way around where I was ingesting weird post-Occupy stuff, and then like went to Radix, and then came from there. Like went back to Marx, went through the Second International, went through instead of the other way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Where I sort of did both simultaneously. I worked forward and backwards.
How dialectic of you.
Yeah, well,
dialectical.
Sort of like when I met Maoist and when I was in college, I thought they were weird, and when I met Trotskyists, I thought they were annoying. And when I met anarchists, which was a predominant formation when I was there, although now that I'm hesitant to call them anarchists because they don't actually have that much link to the classical anarchist tradition at all. I thought they were super annoying. Which is that's a bad reason to make tendency decisions. But honestly, it's how most people make them. If they admit it to themselves, there's like, either that or like, there's all these obnoxious white people or whatever. So Trotsky argued that in the imperialist era, national bourgeoisie and undeveloped countries were structurally incapable of carrying out a democratic revolution too, because they would always be tied to foreign capital. And I wonder if Dengism kind of proves some of this point.
It's kind of a good point, yeah.
And that local, therefore, the working class must take power immediately and push the bourgeois revolution straight through into a socialist one without stopping. That's what permanent revolution meant. So instead of like, it wasn't revolution forever, although that's part of it, but it was the idea that like, we're not going to have stages. We're going to take charge, and we're just going to do the bourgeois development ourselves, which is kind of actually what Dengism ends up doing. But the issue is like, there still needs to be an admission that there's no such thing as a national bourgeoisie that stays just national. There's no way for you to do that. And I actually, in looking at the Bukharin versus Luxemburg versus, to some degree, although Lenin was really siding with Bukharin in a lot of ways, but he took some things out. But like Bukharin's focus on national cartels and the belief that like capitalism could be solvent in one country theoretically, even though he says that they're not actually, does actually make more sense about how he arrived at socialism in one country. Because he kind of thought national capitalism was possible and Luxemburg didn't. My issue with Luxemburg is that I don't think how she solves the problem makes any sense, including how she defines what is outside of capitalism, because it just seems to be like random shit.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, you have it. You also have the Luxemburgist idea that like, as soon as you finish capitalizing the world, it will collapse because there's no place for it to grow. And when I don't think that's true, I think there's the counter tendencies argument's actually pretty good.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
So anyway, so Trotskyists argued that a political alliance with the national bourgeoisie would subordinate the independent class interests of the proletariat, and also the national bourgeoisie would not stay national. And I do kind of think there's some truth to that. That's why, like, just to point out, for all we've been talking about oligarchs and shit, when Trump visited Xi this a couple weeks ago, and this was recorded in May of 2026, so this will probably come out probably 2 months later, but nonetheless, they actually were meaner to Trump than they were to the tech oligarchs.
Yeah.
They kind of wined and dine Musk and co, who are objectively reactionary forces.
Yeah.
And I do think that does kind of put a pin on where they are. The other things is they'll help Iran, but they won't risk war over it.
Yep.
They'll help Cuba kinda with some shipments of oil, but they won't risk war over it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a limit to how much oil they are willing to or can because of Iran ship. And they don't get along. I mean, like the Chinese interest with North Korea is actually interesting because one things that we can kind of look at is Kim Jong-un has done Honecker-esque, that's DDR, Democratic Dutch Deutsche Republic, are so the East German style late East German style liberalizations, as much as it can because the sanctions are so heavy.
Yeah.
But that is why there is development under Kim Jong-un as opposed to Kim Jong-il. But yeah, Trotskyists contended that holding back workers to placate patriotic capitalists, delay a socialist transition, disarm workers' independent power, like the Soviets, and sow delusions that capitalists could be patriotic allies, period.
I think that's the question that you were mentioning, like when the last of the the collaboration generation dies out. Like that's the question that we're kind of going to be waiting to see is that does this devolve? Like, is this Trotskyist critique correct?
Right.
Was the revolution delayed? Will the revolution be betrayed? But yeah, I think that critique holds some water.
So the left communists and what we might call ultra orthodox Marxists, those aren't quite the same thing, but you guys can critique new democracy from the standpoint of basic definitions of socialism. They say it preserves a commodity form, wage labor in the market. That's what Lacerdo is arguing against. Marx would say probably some of those things have to be. I think Marx would say probably some of those things, although I'm not sure it's the market, actually have to be preserved in transition. But it is a transition. And, my thing about Lacerdo is he seems to think that we should just accept that as communism.
I'll say I feel like I might not have my dates right about this, but I'm thinking about the new democracy setup, and I'm thinking about the Cultural Revolution, and there were real attempts to abolish currency and the commodity form during that.
Yeah, there were.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So I know they didn't work, but it doesn't seem like new democracy in and of itself prevented that from happening. Or maybe it did.
But they weren't real. The thing is, they weren't. That's the time where they were the least new democratic. And
that's fair.
And they really were trying to get rid of the bourgeoisie without killing them. So I think the traditional Marxists have kind of a point if you say that the goal needs to be something beyond state capitalism, which I think is correct, but it's how immediate do you think that needs to be? Particularly in these places that did not have bourgeois national revolutions weren't weird settler imperial outgrowths of bourgeois national revolutions. So I think we're going to stop here. We're going to come back to this. And I think our next episode, which we'll try to record relatively soon, we'll be finishing off talking about New Democracy, and then use it as a transition to build to our sixth episode. Fifth. No, at that point it'll be sixth. Our sixth episode on national frontism, communist, and not. Mostly not, actually, historically, but and I think we can then start parsing some weirder things like National Bolshevism, which has never really had a revolution, but it's a tendency that I don't love, and whatnot there. I'm going to talk about some other critiques next time of this, and then we can use it to pivot over to discussions about China in general, and then national fronts.
Sounds great.
All right. Take care.